Good morning.
Good morning, Kathy.
Good morning. Good morning, Professor Schwartz. How are you today?
Very good. Thank you for offering to interview me. I really,
You're welcome. Thank you so much. It's so nice to have you today. It's really nice to talk with you. When we talk about Kissinger, we inevitably talk about the secret visit to China in 1971
yes.
and Nixon's visit to China in 1972. So based on your study, why Kissinger will be willing to pay a visit to China in 1971, and what role did he play in prompting the visit by President Nixon to China?
When Kissinger was in office, we had no relations with China. We had no contacts directly. And he and Nixon together reestablished a diplomatic relationship with China and began a process of summit meetings, of frequent trips. They began a process of secret diplomacy through Pakistan, of establishing a contact. When Kissinger went on his secret mission, the goal was to establish the possibility then of Nixon visiting China. And at the end of the meeting, they agreed that President Nixon can visit. And this was a bombshell in American politics. This was a complete and total surprise that something like this could happen. And it also helped Nixon politically. What people don't remember, and what I point out in my book, is that the American people were very enthusiastic about the China visit. And when Nixon did visit China, an astounding number of Americans watched the coverage on television, some 95%, something that you never see in most cases of diplomacy or news. We're aware that Nixon had gone to China. That was quite an extraordinary moment in American history.
Yes, and we also know that the trip to China has made a great achievements, including the issuance of the Shanghai Communique. So from your point of view, what kind of result did Kissinger want to see at that time, and did he really make it?
By that agreement, he was able to establish a tie to the People's Republic that otherwise would have been impossible. If the United States had argued for Taiwanese independence or separation from China, the government of the People's Republic would never have accepted that.
So after this ice-breaking visit for the past 50 years, Kissinger has been contributing to the development of China-US relations and the exchanges between the two countries. So he's been visiting China for about 100 times. And he's been promoting the U.S. government to pursue a positive policy toward China. So from your point of view, why he is still so active in the international political arena today? And why he's working so hard to call for the improvement of the China-U.S. relations?
Well, I would argue that Henry Kissinger has seen it as his both legacy and his contribution to try and prevent conflict between great powers. I think he recognizes that in the rise of China and the fact that the United States and China are now comparable world powers, and Kissinger, I think, sees his legacy and his mission as trying to prevent conflict between the United States and China by encouraging a positive policy. And I think it ultimately rests on Kissinger's idea that conflict, any type of war between the United States and China would be a disaster for human civilization, and that the overriding goal has to be a cooperative relationship between these two great powers. And I think that's why he has devoted so much attention and time to it. It's something he believes in strongly and is committed to. Now Kissinger, I think, recognizes that the United States and China have to accept their differences, and they have to find ways to moderate those differences. Both countries have different political systems, they have different ideologies, and I think Kissinger, for one, has always believed that that should not mean you can't have peaceful coexistence. But he also recognizes, I think, that there are irritants in the relationship and that those need to be addressed directly. And that's, I think, one of the things he has been stressing in interviews recently, that we have to address these issues.
Has his point of view inspired you, especially in terms of foreign policy, China-US relations, or maintaining the stability of the international community? So what is your attitudes towards the China-US relations?
I think there's a real positive in Henry Kissinger's approach, that Kissinger himself recognizes that diplomacy is really essential in any international relationship, The United States and China are interconnected now, economically and in so many other ways. I think those connections on a personal level, as well as diplomatic, have to be nourished and cared for. And I think the United States and China have to engage in an understanding that the world is certainly big enough for both of them, and that they can both accommodate each other, and that they benefit from their economic ties with each other. Even though some of what Kissinger says is still controversial, I think what he is saying still makes a great deal of sense, and I think should be listened to.
Yes, and like you just mentioned the U.S. policy, so what do you think of Kissinger's comments on the Biden administration's policy toward China?
Well, I think he is largely correct that the administration's policies toward China are basically reactive policies. They don't seem to have a larger strategy or plan. This is not unusual in American politics. Our foreign policy is usually been one that's largely reactive to events rather than strategically planned out. Kissinger, in some ways, he did try to have a larger strategic vision when he was in office. I think Kissinger is also saying, look, it would be helpful if you guys at least heard me out, and it would be something.
What kind of inspiration can Kissinger give us? Like, what reference does he have for China and the United States in handling the relationship between the two countries?
I think if Kissinger is inspiring in any particular direction, it is the notion of reopening a sort of annual or semi-annual summit on military, political, and economic issues. They're all crucial, and the United States and China have got to be speaking to each other on all these issues.
What do you think his understanding of China came from?
Well, you know, the interesting thing about Henry Kissinger is he really had no interest in China before he became National Security Advisor. If you look at his career up to 1969, he wrote little about China. He's largely a self-taught China specialist in the sense that after he made the secret visit, before the secret visit, he was briefed by a number of China experts, but after he made the visit, he became a student of China and has read extensively then on Chinese history, politics, economics. And this is largely his own self-education in this, and from talking to Chinese leaders. As you mentioned, he's made over 100 trips. That has led to a great familiarity with all parts of China, with regions, with different leaders over this time, so much so that he has an extensive network of Chinese figures that have had contact with him.
I want to know, do you have any personal stories with Kissinger that you would like to share with us?
A couple of quick personal stories. One is when I first went to meet him. It was very difficult to arrange. He has security. He's not very fond of historians in America because he feels that many of the historians write books quite critical of him. It was very difficult for me to get an interview with him, but when I did get the interview with him, I told him that I hoped to write a short book about him that would be accessible to many people. And he looked at me and said, but you will leave things out. And I think he was concerned that if I tried to write something too short, I would not get a sense of the various issues that he had to deal with and how complex they were. And he was right in the sense that I ended up writing a much longer book than I had intended. My interview with him was also a challenging one because he originally said he would talk to me for about a half an hour, and then we ended up almost an hour into the conversation because I raised issues and he would get into them. He was quite defensive about some things, but then toward the end of the interview, we ended up talking about the World Cup and soccer. And soccer is one of his great fascinations. So we had a very interesting conversation about that. Subsequent to that, I had the opportunity to ask him questions at various events at the State Department.
What can people learn from him, especially politicians from the United States and China? What can they learn from him?
I think on the whole, the relationship with China, which is, I think, going to be so consequential to whether there is peace in the 21st century and whether the world advances and whether poverty decreases, whether you have economic development around the world, really rests on this U.S.-China relationship. And in that sense, I think what Kissinger offers as a lesson is the real significance of getting this right, of trying to keep the relationship on an even keel and allowing for the development of good relations over time that will provide for peace and security and stability in the world as a whole. Because I think one of the things that can be crucial to long-term peace and stability would be the degree to which Americans and Chinese know each other's countries, live in them, experience them, learn languages, and learn the history. And that would be a crucial element. And I'd like to be able to contribute to that.